Hey y'all, and welcome to Politibrawl. My name is Brian, and President Trump and President Bukele both take turns tag teaming against Kaitlan Collins from CNN. This is wild. Let's dive in.
Let's hear the question from this very low-rated anchor at CB.
Thank you, President Trump. Do you plan to ask President
Low-rated.
Bukele to help return the man who your administration says was mistakenly
Which one is it?
deported? The man who was mistakenly deported to El Salvador?
Well, let me ask Pam, would you answer that question?
Sure, President. First and foremost, he was illegally in our country. He had been illegally in our country. And in 2019, two courts, an immigration court and an appellate immigration court, ruled that he was a member of MS-13 and he was illegally in our country. Right now, it was additional paperwork had needed to be done. That's up to El Salvador if they want to return him. That's not up to us. The Supreme Court ruled, President, that if, as El Salvador wants to return him, this is international matters, foreign affairs, if they wanted to return him, we would facilitate it, meaning provide a plane.
So will you return him,
And
President Bukele?
you are doing a great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stephen Miller, wait a minute. Can you just also respond to that question? Because, you know, it's asked by CNN, and they always ask it with a slant, because they're totally slanting because they don't know what's happening. That's why nobody's watching them. But would you answer that question also, please?
Yes, gladly. So, as Pam mentioned, there's an illegal alien from El Salvador. So, with respect to you, he's a citizen of El Salvador. So, it's very arrogant even for American media to suggest that we would even tell El Salvador how to handle their own citizens as a starting point. As two immigration courts found that he was a member of MS-13. When President Trump declared MS-13 to be a foreign terrorist organization, that meant that he was no longer eligible under federal law, which I'm sure you know, you're very familiar with the INA, that he was no longer eligible for any form of immigration relief in the United States. So he had a deportation order that was valid, which meant that under our law, he's not even allowed to be present in the United States and had to be returned because of the foreign terrorist designation. This issue was then, by a district court judge, completely inverted, and a district court judge tried to tell the administration that they had to kidnap a citizen of El Salvador and fly him back here. That issue was raised to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said the district court order was unlawful and its main components were reversed 9-0 unanimously, stating clearly that neither Secretary of State nor the President could be compelled by anybody to forcibly retrieve a citizen of El Salvador from El Salvador, who again is a member of MS-13, which, as I'm sure you understand, rapes little girls, murders women, murders children, is engaged in the most barbaric activities in the world, and I can promise you if he was your neighbor, you would move right away.
So you don't plan to
But the
ask for
Supreme
him
Court's
to get
asking
him back?
to,
Is
And
that-
what was the ruling
Is that your
in the Supreme Court, Steve? Was it 9-0?
Yes, it was a 9-0
In our favor?
in our favor against the district court ruling, saying that no district court has the power to compel the foreign policy function of the United States. As Pam said, the ruling solely stated that if this individual at El Salvador's sole discretion was sent back to our country, that we could deport him a second time.
Well,
No version of this legally ends up with him ever living here because he is a citizen of El Salvador. That is the president of El Salvador. Your questions about it, per the court, can only be directed to him.
I asked
¿Usted lo
President
liberaría,
Bukele, what is
Presidente
your, can President Bukele weigh in on this? Do you plan to return him?
Well, I'm suppose you're not suggesting that I smuggle a terrorist into the United States, right?
It's
I mean,
always
how can I smuggle, how can I return him to the United States? Like, I smuggle him into the United States, or what do I do? Of course, I'm not gonna do it. It's like, I mean, the question is preposterous. How can I smuggle a terrorist into the United States? I don't have the power to return him to the United States.
so you can release him inside El Salvador.
Yeah, but I'm not releasing, I mean, we're not very fond of releasing terrorists into our country. I mean, we just turned the murder capital of the world into the safest country of the Western Hemisphere, and you want us to go back into releasing criminals so we can go back to being the murder capital of the world? No, that's not going to happen.
Well, they'd love to have a criminal,
Yeah,
released into
I mean, there's a fascination.
They would love it.
Yeah.
They're sick. These are sick people.
Y'all, as funny as it is to watch two presidents dunk on CNN and Kaitlan Collins in general, we do have to remember that we are dealing with a very dishonest press who has been trying to lie out of both sides of their mouth when it comes to Abreu Garcia and the recent Supreme Court ruling. The Supreme Court ruled 9-0 that Abrego Garcia doesn't belong in that Supermax prison. What they didn't say, however, is how he was actually supposed to be brought back. In other words, they understood the letter of the law to be basically that a district court judge technically messed something up along the way, and so something needs to happen in order for this to be made completely correct. However, this is the kicker here. President Trump has to facilitate the man's release from the Supermax prison with President Bukele. And essentially, what they're saying in this whole clip is, this dude ain't coming back to the United States. Okay? This dude entered the United States as an illegal migrant back in 2011. He then married, had a kid, and was once detained during the first Trump administration, but a judge let him out. And then, once the Trump administration found him for a second time, and now have found all these weird dealings with MS-13. It's a bunch of he said, she said going on with this story, by the way, which is an awful story, because he had to leave El Salvador because he was either associated with the gang or directly because of gang violence. And he seems to have made good here in the United States, so that's cool, but he's here illegally. He has no fundamental rights here. Okay? That's the sad, horrible truth. And the mainstream media, instead of talking about this aspect, saying that maybe the Democrats in Congress need to talk to Republicans again and try to pass a better piece of legislation than they did last time. The reason Republicans said no to the bipartisan bill about a year and a half ago, about a year ago, a little over a year ago. And they ultimately said no to this compromise because there was a poison pill introduced by the Democrats. That is, if you are detained by any border agent at any time and you've crossed the border, all you can say is, I seek asylum, and then you are allowed in the United States, no questions asked. All right? That was a major part of this bipartisan bill, and the president said absolutely not. That is not a kind of bill that we need to support. That would continue to allow the problem to get worse and worse. Well, guess what? The problem has gotten to a point where someone has even been able to make good here in the United States, had a family, seemed to have a fairly clean record outside of that, has probably shed a lot of his former ties. Well, guess what? He's still here illegally. So maybe the mainstream media should be asking their more Democrat followers, because let's be honest, that's who the mainstream media continues to cater to. Maybe the Democrats should get off their rear ends and actually deal with this problem so something like this doesn't happen again, at least in the sense that this man who should have been seeking asylum at some point wasn't able to game our system and come in under better terms and pretenses and allowed an opportunity to achieve the American dream. But the Democrats don't care about that because their constituents don't care about that. You can tell because of the way Stephen Miller and Pam Bondi are talking to Kaitlan Collins here, because this question is not asked in good faith. The question of what are you going to do about Mr. Garcia directed at both these presidents is not done in good faith. And so this is what the Supreme Court actually ruled. Okay, the Supreme Court said the district court order properly requires the government to facilitate Abrego Garcia's release from custody in El Salvador and ensure that his case is handled as it would have been had he not improperly sent to El Salvador. So, translation: the dude needs to sort of change hands, so to speak. In other words, the Supreme Court's basically treating this guy like he is a cow, that he's got to be transported to this location so he can be transported back to almost the exact same location. Or, in order to facilitate the man's release, Trump and Bukele can simply have an agreement of, okay, this dude needs to be deported, no longer to your Supermax prison, but to this area, and we just need you to follow up on that. That's all that needs to be done here. But the mainstream media has been lying about this story so profusely that that's not what's going to be reported on here, okay? So that's why when you see Donald Trump, it looks, if you're in the mainstream media bubble, it looks like he's once again flaunting the law, when the reality is he's following it. Okay? He's forced to put on a completely different facade here because, guess what? The well has been poisoned. You can't drink from a well that has been poisoned. You need to put some iodine pills in there, wait a while, make sure nothing else gets in there, and then test it again. That's what has happened to our public discourse, all thanks to the sensationalist mainstream media, like, of course, people like Kaitlan Collins. That's why Pam Bondi, Caroline Levitt, and I think I misspoke. I don't think that was Pam Bondi. That might have been Caroline Levitt. I couldn't tell. That was only the side profile, but seriously, let me know if I got that wrong down in the comments. But that's why Pam Bondi has been doing the things that she's been doing. That's why Caroline Levitt has been doing the things that she's been doing. That's why Stephen Miller has been railing against these reporters, and that's also why Kash Patel has been acting in his own purview. And furthermore, you know that this has been a bad reporter and have been a bad media system when when a president from another nation invited into the Oval Office is basically just putting his hands in his lap and saying, "I'm with Trump on this one. Y'all are being ridiculous." And that's because Bukele is the reason El Salvador has been able to turn things around. That has become one of the two big turnaround stories, arguably three if you want to consider Colombia. But Colombia, El Salvador, and Argentina, which, by the way, two of those had basically political revolutions, soft revolutions, and now Argentina's thriving, now El Salvador is thriving, all because they've cleaned up their crime problem in El Salvador, and all because Milei has cleaned up his ridiculous bureaucratic problem in Argentina. It seems like Donald Trump is taking leads from both of these gentlemen and taking it up to 11 here in his second term, and I am all here for it. Meanwhile, the mainstream media is happy that they were able to latch on the first story that they've been able to get their hands on, where someone has technically, due to a different way of processing, and because his status of being an MS-13 member is up in the air, they got to latch onto this story and blast it from the airwaves, when now the Supreme Court has basically said, no, this dude probably needs to be deported. Donald Trump just facilitate his release, get back to us on that. The reality is, Trump won this situation, and the mainstream media lost. And of course, they're not going to report on it that way, and that's why you get such vitriol towards them from two former presidents, Stephen Miller and either Caroline Levitt or Pam Bondi, and it's just glorious to watch. Folks, my name is Brian. Hope you enjoyed that segment here on Politibrawl. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Catch you on the next one. And until then, y'all have a good one.